When it comes to fiscal policy can be done at the municipal level, that is cities, can be done at the provincial level, can be done at the federal level. So municipalities, provincial governments, and federal governments all can spend money and can tax. So as we look at fiscal policy, we need to look at the different types of fiscal policy that can be used. There is discretionary fiscal policy and automatic fiscal policy. Discretionary fiscal policy is deliberate changes in government spending or taxation to achieve a specific outcome. So it's deliberate. It's at someone's discretion. Automatic fiscal policy are procedures that are put in place to automatically occur to help smooth out the business cycle. That is, when things are bad, we make it not as bad, and when things are good, we make it not as good, just to kind of level it out so we don't have too much inflation or too high of unemployment. So we're going to look at each one of these, and let's start with discretionary fiscal policy. So let's actually just create a blank page here. And let's look at discretionary fiscal policy. And let's start first by looking at government spending. All right, so let's suppose that there is let's look at expansionary fiscal policy. Okay, and let's draw here our aggregate demand and our aggregate supply. So expansionary fiscal policy is when government spending increases. When government spending increases, remember government spending is part of aggregate expenditures, C plus I plus G plus X minus IM. So when government spending increases, aggregate demand increases, which is a shift to the right. Okay? And when aggregate demand increases, it's going to make prices go up, and real GDPs, remember this is price levels here, this is real GDP down here. So prices will go up and real GDP will increase. So tell me, when would you use expansionary fiscal policy? What kind of gap are you trying to close? Well, if you have here your potential GDP, and this was your actual, then by increasing aggregate demand, we have closed the gap. So what kind of gap do we have if our actual is less than our potential? We have a recessionary gap. So expansionary fiscal policy closes recessionary gaps by causing government spending to increase, increases aggregate demand, and gets us back at potential GDP. All right, so what about contractionary fiscal policy? Here's aggregate demand, here's aggregate supply. If we have contractionary fiscal policy, then government spending is decreasing, which causes aggregate demand to do what? To decrease. And if aggregate demand goes down, it's a shift to the left, then that's making the price go down and real GDP to decrease as well. So when would you want to decrease aggregate demand? When you have what kind of gap? Well, if our potential was less than our actual, that means the economy was growing beyond where it could be if you used all of its land, labor, capital, and enterprise. So we're seeing lots of growth. We want to slow it down. So if we want to slow down the economy, we use contractionary fiscal policy, and that fixes the inflation problem you have if the economy is growing too fast because it makes prices go down. And so we would use this to close an expansionary gap, also called an inflationary gap. So we close that expansionary gap. The economy is growing too quickly. We want to slow it down by having it contract a bit. All right, so when it comes to discretionary fiscal policy, we can use expansionary fiscal policy to close a recessionary gap. We can use contractionary fiscal policy to close an expansionary gap, or we can use the supply side approach to fiscal policy. So let's look at what that would look like. So the supply side approach to fiscal policy has the government spending, but in this case, it's what the government is spending money on. So if the government invests in infrastructure, in capital goods, and education, then not only is it going to impact aggregate demand, but it's also going to impact aggregate supply and potential GDP. Because remember, what changed potential GDP? What changed potential GDP was change in raw materials, technology, capital goods, or the quantity and quality of workers. So education would impact the quality of workers. Capital goods, of course, is one of those. And building more infrastructure would increase the productivity of the company. Well, what were the things that changed aggregate supply? They were the same things that increased potential GDP plus changes in the cost of your factors of production. So if the government invests in infrastructure, capital goods, or education, then you're going to start to change aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and potential GDP. Aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and potential as well. So the key here is that aggregate demand would increase, aggregate supply would increase. And remember, potential GDP is going to change by the same amount as your aggregate supply. So our aggregate supply went from here to here. It changes our potential as well. So then the question is, okay, well, what happens to price? Well, the challenge with what happens to price is it depends on how much aggregate demand changes versus how much aggregate supply changes. If aggregate demand and aggregate supply change the same amount, then the price is not going to change. If aggregate supply changes more than aggregate demand, then prices will go down. And if aggregate demand increases more than aggregate supply, prices go up. So it's not clear what happens to prices with this approach. What we do know is what happens to real GDP. Because if the government invests in infrastructure, capital goods, and education, it increases aggregate demand, which increases the amount of goods that we're buying. It increases aggregate supply, which increases the goods that are being sold, and all of it makes real GDP go up. Now, does that put you into a recessionary gap or an expansionary gap? Well, it depends on where you started, and it also depends on which changes are bigger. Aggregate supply, aggregate demand. In the graph that we drew here, because there was an equal increase in aggregate demand and aggregate supply, then we can start at full employment equilibrium and end up there as well. All right, so this was all a change in government spending. Let's look at a change in taxes. So we're still looking at discretionary fiscal policy. The only difference now is we want to look at change in taxes. So let's add a blank page here. Okay. So discretionary fiscal policy. In this case, we're looking at taxation. So let's start with expansionary fiscal policy. So tell me, expansionary fiscal policy, would that be an increase or a decrease in taxes? Okay, So, and here's our graph, aggregate demand, aggregate supply. With expansionary fiscal policy, we would decrease taxes. When you decrease taxes, that means aggregate demand increases because we have more money in our pocket, more disposable income, so we're now going to spend it. Aggregate demand increases. So when we do this, we would do this if this was our potential and this was our actual. If our potential is more than our actual, then increasing aggregate demand would close the gap. So expansionary fiscal policy is used to close what type of gap? A recessionary gap. Now, the important thing to note here is that when you're using expansionary fiscal policy, right, we can either increase government spending or lower taxes or both. Well, when you lower taxes, there's not a guarantee that all that money turns into an increase in aggregate demand, right? We could choose to save some of that money instead. So decreasing taxes doesn't have the same impact as increasing government spending. Okay? The increase in government spending increases the aggregate demand more. All right, second one. Oops. Make that go away. All right, number 2. Number 2 is contractionary fiscal policy. So with contractionary fiscal policy, here's aggregate demand, here's aggregate supply. We're trying to close what type of gap? We're trying to close an expansionary gap. So let's draw an expansionary gap. Expansionary gap says here's our potential, and there's our actual. So how would you close an expansionary gap? You need aggregate demand to decrease. So what could we do with taxes to make aggregate demand decrease? Well, if we make taxes go up, then that's less money left in our pocket, so aggregate demand goes down, and that closes an expansionary gap. The third type of discretionary fiscal policy is a supply-side approach. And in this case, what we're doing is we're changing corporate taxes and sales taxes. So if we take corporate taxes and we make them go down, and we make sales taxes go down, then that changes the cost to the business. Because when you go and buy a product, it's the business that's paying the sales tax to the government on your behalf. So as a customer, sales taxes just impact the price, and price doesn't change demand or supply. To the business, that tax is a cost. It's a cut away from some of their profit. Just like corporate taxes, take away some of that money that the business makes. So if we lower the corporate taxes and we lower the sales tax, then we're actually increasing the aggregate supply because the cost to make the goods has gone down. So when would you do this? When would you lower corporate taxes and sales taxes? Well, you would do that if this was your potential and this was your actual. So if your actual is less than your potential and you increase aggregate supply, then you close the gap. So supply-siders would lower corporate taxes and lower sales taxes to close recessionary gaps. In 2017, what you're hearing from the US government is calls to lower the corporate tax rate because they want to increase aggregate supply to help grow the economy. So this would be our actual. We'd increase aggregate supply so that we could increase our real GDP and close, for example, a recessionary gap. All right, so when it comes to discretionary fiscal policy, we can change government spending. Well, there we go. We could change government spending, in which case we can have expansionary fiscal policy, which makes government spending go up. We could use contractionary fiscal policy, which makes government spending go down. Or we could take a supply side approach and have the government spend on infrastructure, capital goods, and education, which then changes aggregate supply as well as aggregate demand. With discretionary fiscal policy, we can also focus on taxation. We can do expansionary fiscal policy by decreasing taxes. We can do contractionary fiscal policy by increasing taxes. Or we can take a supply side approach, in which case we're changing the taxes that impact our businesses to increase the aggregate supply.